When the Second World War began in 1939, Australia was a young country, barely 4 decades old as a unified nation. It had no great empire, no mighty navy, and no sprawling industry. But what it did have was courage. And a deep sense of duty to the British Commonwealth. Across the world, Europe was collapsing under the weight of fascism. Germany's armies rolled across Poland, Denmark, Norway, fanned rance. The Blitz darkened the skies over London. And in Africa, Mussolini's legions marched east from Libya toward the Suez Canal, threatening the British Empire's lifeline to India and the Pacific. In that chaos, one small but determined force would do something remarkable. They would attempt and succeed in a type of warfare no one else had managed. They would launch the first successful amphibious assault of the Second World War. And then, 2 years later, they'd do it again. The Desert Gamble. It began in the scorching heat of North Africa. By the end of 1940, the British 8th Army had been forced onto the defensive. Italy's 10th Army, 250,000 men strong, had invaded Egypt. For the British Empire, this was a direct threat, not just to its colonies, but to the entire Middle East. But in December of that year, the tide began to turn. A small but spirited offensive called Operation Compass was launched. Among its spearhead was a fresh division, tough, raw, and full of confidence from the other side of the world. The Australians. They called themselves diggers. They were volunteers, not conscripts. Many had fathers who'd fought at Gallipoli and grandfathers from the Boer War. Now they would write a new chapter in Australia's military history. The Fortress of Bardia. The Italians had built a stronghold, the coastal fortress of Bardia, in eastern Libya. From the sea, it looked like a maze of concrete and wire. From the air, it stretched for miles, trenches, bunkers, minefields, anti-tank ditches, all reinforced with heavy guns. Inside were 45,000 Italian troops, backed by tanks and artillery. It was the first major Italian base west of Egypt. Capturing it would open the road to Tobruk and beyond. British planners hesitated. They remembered Gallipoli, that disastrous landing a generation earlier, when thousands of Australians had died on another Mediterranean shore. The idea of attacking another fortified coast seemed like madness, but the Australians weren't thinking about the past. They were thinking about victory. The plan. Major General Ivan Mackay, commanding the 6th Australian Division, had a daring idea. While most of his troops would attack the fortress from the landward side, a smaller contingent would make an amphibious assault from the sea, striking the Italians where they least expected it. It was risky. No one had tried such a landing since the First World War, but the Australians believed surprise could outweigh the danger. They worked with the Royal Australian Navy to assemble landing craft crude, improvised but functional. They studied the tides, rehearsed in secret, and prepared for a type of warfare no textbook had yet defined. Meanwhile, the Italians felt safe. They believed their coastal guns made a seaborne attack impossible. They were wrong. The morning of January 3, 1941, before dawn, the desert lay silent. Then the world exploded. At precisely 5:30 a.m., British and Australian artillery opened up with more than 100 guns. Shells screamed across the sand, smashing into bunkers and minefields. Naval destroyers offshore joined in, hammering the coastal defenses. For the Italians, it was chaos. Communications broke down, command posts went silent, and through that storm, the Australians moved. On the landward side, infantry from the 16th Brigade advanced, blowing gaps in the wire. Matilda tanks rolled through, crushing obstacles, and from the sea, hidden by smoke and confusion, came the first wave of Australian landing craft. It was the first modern combined amphibious assault of World War II, the landing. Small boats cut through the surf, engines whining under strain. Inside, Australian troops crouched low, gripping their rifles, hearts pounding. They weren't elite commandos. They weren't special forces. They were ordinary men, farmers, miners, students, thrust into one of the most dangerous operations imaginable. As the boats grounded, ramps slammed down. The men splashed into waist-deep water and charged forward. Bullets snapped past, sand flew, but the Italians, already panicked by the inland assault, couldn't mount an organized defense. The Australians seized the beaches, blew open the coastal defenses, and linked up with the forces advancing from the desert. By the afternoon, Italian positions were collapsing. 3 days later, Bardia fell. Aftermath of Bardia. The victory stunned the world. 45,000 Italian prisoners, including 4 generals, marched into captivity. Hundreds of guns, tanks, and vehicles were captured. It was the largest Italian surrender in the war so far, And most remarkable of all, it had been achieved through a bold, improvised amphibious operation. British commanders took note. Field Marshal Archibald Wavell praised the Australians for their energy and resolution. Reports were sent to London describing how the Australians had coordinated naval and land forces with precision and daring. The operation became a quiet lesson in Allied headquarters, that a small, flexible force could do what massive armies couldn't if they used creativity and speed. It was the first successful amphibious assault of World War II, and it was Australian. Lessons from the desert. Bardia proved that amphibious warfare wasn't dead, it just needed reinvention. The Australians had shown how limited resources could achieve maximum effect through coordination, adaptability, and courage. Their engineers had improvised landing craft. Their signal units had devised new ways to communicate between land and sea. And their infantry had adapted tactics on the fly, bypassing bunkers, cutting through defenses, and exploiting confusion. The techniques developed at Bardia would later be studied by British and American planners as they prepared for invasions in Europe and the Pacific. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't widely celebrated, but it was pioneering, and it set the stage for something even greater, their second amphibious triumph, in a war that was about to shift closer to home. A new front, a new enemy. In 1942, everything changed. Japan entered the war with a thunderclap attacking Pearl Harbor, sweeping through Southeast Asia, and seizing territory across the Pacific. The British fortress of Singapore, once thought impregnable, fell in February. Tens of thousands of Allied troops were captured. For Australia, the threat was now at their doorstep. Bombers hit Darwin. Japanese submarines prowled the Australian coast. And in the dense jungles of New Guinea, just north of the mainland, the Japanese were advancing toward Port Moresby. The Australians would now fight for their own survival. And in this new, brutal theater of war, they would once again do something no other nation had yet managed. They would land from the sea and win. The Pacific turns dark. After years of desert warfare, the Australians found themselves in a new kind of hell. Gone were the wide horizons of North Africa, the clear skies, the open terrain. Now they faced a wall of green, a jungle so dense it swallowed sound and men whole. In early 1942, as Japanese forces spread like wildfire across the Pacific, Australia stood nearly alone. The British were overstretched in Europe. The Americans were reeling from Pearl Harbor, and the Japanese were looking south. Port Moresby, on the island of New Guinea, became the key to Australia's survival. If Japan captured it, northern Australia would lie within easy bombing range. If Australia held it, the Pacific could still be saved. This was no longer a fight for empire. It was a fight for home. The men of the New Guinea force. The soldiers sent to New Guinea were different from those who'd fought in Africa. They were veterans of Tobruk, Bardia, and Greece. Men hardened by dust and fire now thrust into mud and humidity. Their uniforms rotted in the constant rain. Their rifles jammed from jungle slime. Leeches crawled up their legs, malaria thinned their ranks, and food spoiled before it could reach the front. They called themselves the Ragged Bloody Heroes, and they would live up to the name. At first, the Japanese advance was unstoppable. They captured Rabaul, then moved toward Port Moresby across the treacherous Kokoda Track, a narrow mountain trail cutting through near impenetrable rainforest. The Australians fought a desperate, brutal withdrawal, then counterattacked and pushed the enemy back. But victory on the ground wasn't enough. To drive the Japanese from New Guinea completely, the Allies needed to strike their bases on the coast, and for that, they would have to return to what the Australians had done first, an amphibious assault. The Ley Plan. In 1943, Allied High Command, now led by American General Douglas MacArthur, prepared to seize Ley, a major Japanese stronghold on the Huon Gulf. The operation was codenamed Postern. The idea was daring. Australian divisions would land by sea near Ley, while airborne troops parachuted in from above. It would be a pincer attack, the first major combined amphibious and airborne operation of the Pacific War. But there was a catch. The Americans were still building up their Pacific fleet. The British were thousands of miles away, and the US Marines, who would later become famous for their island landings, had not yet executed a successful amphibious assault. That meant one thing: once again, it would fall to the Australians to lead the way. Preparation in the Pacific. In mid-1943, Australian engineers, sailors, and soldiers began preparing for the assault. The beaches near Ley were treacherous, narrow, shallow, and lined with coral reefs. The tides were unpredictable, and the area was covered by Japanese artillery from the mountains above. The Australians, working with the US Navy, designed new landing craft LCIs, landing craft infantry, capable of delivering men directly onto the beaches. They studied the tides, mapped the reefs, and conducted trial runs in the nearby harbors of Milne Bay. The lessons of Bardia, learned 2 years earlier, now returned. Coordination between sea and land, surprise and precision, and total commitment. The Australians had done this before. Now they would do it again on an even greater scale. September 4, 1943, the second first. At dawn on September 4, 1943, the sea off New Guinea shimmered under a gray sky. Dozens of landing craft bobbed in the surf, engines rumbling. Aboard them were men of the 9th Australian Division, veterans of Tobruk, El Alamein, and the deserts of North Africa. They were returning to the fight, this time on their own doorstep. Naval guns opened fire. Shells crashed into the jungle, and from the sea, the Australians surged forward. The landing was a masterpiece of coordination. Despite the reefs and unpredictable surf, the troops hit the beaches almost exactly on schedule. The Japanese were caught off guard, their attention fixed inland, expecting a different axis of attack. Within hours, Australian infantry had established a beachhead. By nightfall, tanks and artillery were coming ashore. The first wave of Japanese counterattacks broke against the beach defenses and were repelled. It was once again a success, the first fully successful Allied amphibious landing in the Pacific. Before the US Marines stormed Tarawa, before the Americans took Guadalcanal by sea, before D-Day, Australians did it first, twice, into the jungle. But the landing was only the beginning. The fight for Lae was brutal. The Australians advanced inland through sodden jungle, chest-deep rivers, and torrential rain. The enemy held high ground and fought tenaciously, using every natural barrier to slow the advance. Still, the Australians pressed on, flanking, encircling, and clearing one Japanese position after another. Airborne forces dropped behind enemy lines to cut off retreats, while the Navy kept supplies flowing through the perilous surf. For days, the jungle swallowed the sound of battle. Gunfire echoed like thunder. Mosquitoes swarmed over the wounded, but the diggers refused to stop. On September 16, 1943, Lae fell. The second amphibious assault led by Australians had succeeded, marking another turning point in the war. The world takes notice. The victory at Lae stunned the Allies and shocked the Japanese. For the first time, the enemy's coastal defenses had been breached by an amphibious landing in the Pacific. The Japanese Imperial General Staff called it an unforeseen and humiliating reversal. General MacArthur personally praised the Australians, saying, "They have set a standard of excellence that will guide all future operations in this theater." American planners studied every aspect of the operation, the coordination, the timing, the engineering, and applied those lessons to their later island assaults. Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, and eventually Okinawa. The techniques born at Bardia and perfected at Lae became the foundation of Allied amphibious warfare. Home front reaction. Back in Australia, the news electrified the public. For months, fear had gripped the nation. Fear that Japan might invade, that the war could be lost. Now, that fear turned to pride. Newspapers declared, "Australians strike first." Families gathered around radios to hear reports of victory. The men who had been written off as colonial auxiliaries were now seen as professionals, innovators, and leaders. It was a moment of national confidence, proof that Australia was not just fighting in someone else's war, but shaping the course of it. Legacy of Lae. Lae was more than a military victory. It was a strategic revelation. The Australians had proven once again that amphibious warfare could be decisive when executed with speed, coordination, and courage. Their methods influenced Allied doctrine for the rest of the war. From the beaches of Normandy to the islands of the Pacific, echoes of Lae could be seen in every landing. The Australians had pioneered the art of combining land, sea, and air, and they had done it not once, but twice. In World War II, Australia did what no other nation dared, and they did it twice. From the deserts of Bardia to the jungles of Lae, they led the first successful amphibious assaults of the war. No vast armies, no fanfare, just courage, innovation, and the will to lead. Their victories rewrote history, and their legacy still echoes across every beach where freedom was won. Because when the world needed the brave, Australians stepped forward, twice.